All right. We are live with Anthony Barnhart, who is an associate professor of psychological science and formerly and currently a professional magician.
More formally,
More
formerly
formally?
than currently. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so is it more of a hobby now that you just kind of keep your skills up?
Yeah, I said I would wait until I had tenure to start marketing myself as a performing magician. And then I got tenure, and then a pandemic happened, and there was no live performance anyway. So, so I've put that
Okay.
part of my life on hold.
Okay. Well, that's fascinating. Now, your position is associated professor of psychological science, and you are also, I think, the department chair, or how does that
I
work?
am.
And what
Yes,
is
I
that?
am. I mean, it just means I have administrative work on top of my teaching load. That's
Okay.
about all it means. I have to schedule classes for the department and eh, all sorts of grunt work that nobody enjoys.
Okay. And a professor of psychological science, is that just a psychology professor?
It
And
is. It is. We rebranded ourselves years ago because our focus is on the science of psychology. When students are majoring in psychology at Carthage College, they are learning research, primarily research methods and statistics. They're learning these skills that are, highly marketable no matter what area you go into after graduation. So we've reframed ourselves in that way. Because I mean, dirty little secret of every psychology program, a very small proportion of the students with a psychology major actually go on into careers that are like psychology centric. Most of them go on into careers that are like tangentially related to psychology. So to train students in all sorts of clinical sorts of things is really putting the cart before the horse. That's the sort of thing they should be learning in graduate programs. So we're imparting a set of skills that they're going to be able to use no matter what direction they go in after graduation.
yeah, I think you've made it a point of saying that you're someone who doesn't actually treat people, you teach people to create experiments.
Yeah, I'm not the kind of psychologist who can help people. I'm a cognitive psychologist. So we are experimental psychologists who study the building blocks of thought. So things like memory and attention and language and perception. Those are the things that are in my wheelhouse. I have never treated a patient in any capacity, and I'm totally unequipped to do so.
Well, I have a funny story for that. I have a really good friend, Tyson Franklin, and he is a podiatrist. And where I'm going with this is he wanted to be an art student or an art teacher, and he told his brother who's a dentist, and his brother said, "Well, you're going to be driving a cheap Volkswagen and never paying your rent." And so he was like, he went to his art teacher and he said, "Well, this is what my brother said," and she said, "Well, I drive a Volkswagen." But he then determined, okay, he's got to go into something medical, right? And he was like, So he became a podiatrist. And the reason was nobody dies and everything can wait till tomorrow.
Yeah, I
So
think
is that kind
that's
of where you are in terms of you got an
absolutely.
experiment and you can wait till tomorrow to do it?
That's true. Yeah, that's fair. I mean, I like every undergraduate psychology major, I thought I wanted to be a clinician. And the
Mhm.
best thing that ever happened to me was not getting into a clinical psychology graduate program my first year out of undergraduate. Because I ended up getting a research gig where I was working alongside clinical psychology graduate students. And I saw the kinds of hoops they had to jump through because they were working with these kind of protected populations and layers of bureaucracy. And I just thought I didn't have the temperament for it. There's no world in which I could actually find the joy in that kind of career. So I thought about the kinds of classes that excited me as an undergraduate, and I landed upon cognitive psychology, in part because it made such direct contact with the experiences I'd had as a performing magician. Because it is studying all of the psychological processes that magicians exploit on a daily basis.
Right, which I love. And you actually kind of came into prominence, I guess, or outside of being a magician in the psychology field because your work is featured in Sleights of Mind. How did that
Yeah.
come about?
Well, so I went to graduate school to be a language researcher. And in fact, a big chunk of the research that I've published is in the area of handwritten word perception, something that has not been studied a lot by psychologists. Everything we know about reading is based on the simplest case of typewritten, pristine words. And so things change when we're looking at how people are able to look at a handwriting sample they've never seen before and read those words off the page. How can they find the signal within all the noise? We don't know. So a big portion of my work is in that area. But while I was in graduate school, I started seeing people publishing work that used magic tricks in the laboratory as a tool for studying attention and perception. And I thought there's really nothing special about me to study language, right? I don't have a leg up on anybody. I can read this research the same way anybody else can. But I have all this training as a magician that I could put to great use that could give me a leg up in this new area of the scientific study of magic. So I looked into who the movers and shakers were in this new discipline. I was at Arizona State University in Tempe, Arizona, and I realized that two of the people that were publishing in this area were just down the road from me at Barrow Neurological Institute in Phoenix, Steve Macknick and Susanna Martinez-Conde. And they were just beginning to think about these issues and were in the early stages of putting together the book that became Sleights of Mind. So I reached out to them and told them who I was and what I was up to, and we developed this long-term collaboration. As you read in the book, I was their magic teacher for a couple of years, and I built an act for them to audition for the Magic Castle and contributed some ideas to the book and went on their book tour with them and things like that. And the interest that this book received from the public and from the scientific community really persuaded me that there's meat on this bone, that a career can be built on this. So beyond just stealing methods from magicians for studying attention and perception, I'm also scouring the magic literature for hypotheses that can be tested in the laboratory. Because magicians are informal cognitive scientists. They have to have hypotheses about how the mind works in order to figure out how a mind can be deceived. And some of these hypotheses are unknown by formal psychology, completely untested, and can potentially be integrated with more formal theories of psychology and can speed our rate of scientific discovery in psychological science. So that's why that has taken a new focus for me. It is, I would say, probably about a third of the work that I do in the laboratory is still in the area of handwritten word perception and language. And now about 2/3 is in the area of the science of magic.
That's fascinating. That actually makes me think of Jonathan Haidt's work, who don't know if you follow him or not, but there's a whole lot of, shall we say, old world wisdom that's known by people practicing, but could not be really proven scientifically. And I'm going to go somewhere with all this, trust me. But now with fMRIs and things like that, they're starting to be able to track and say, oh, you know what? Like the happiness hypothesis of Haidt, a lot of the quote wisdom in all these old books is now being written out as pop psychology in newer books. So this kind of reminds me of that. Like you have an old, it's like, all the scientists are saying, well, we've got to come up with an experiment about inattentional or intentional blindness. And they say, well, what if we have a gorilla bouncing by the basketballs? And magicians are going, well, that was so 200 years ago.
That's right.
Okay. I actually have a question on this because this other gentleman came up in the book too. And I have a local site. I like to plug it, and people on locals will put in questions when I announce the show ahead of time. So people, please check it out. But they want to know if you remember the amazing Randi and the Skeptical Inquirer magazine.
Yes, absolutely. And in fact, today I am wearing my Pegasus pin. For many years, James Randi gave out the Pegasus Award to someone who was engaged in pseudoscientific behavior. Of course, it went to Uri Geller, it went to Sylvia Browne, it went to some parapsychologists along the way. So yes, I knew Randi and we met through the Sleights of Mind process. When I first, so I occasionally teach a course on the psychological science of magic. And in the very first iteration of that course that I taught at Arizona State many years ago, James Randi flew in to be a guest speaker to the students. And it was so exciting. My one regret is that I didn't better prepare the students to appreciate what a unique opportunity they were being given, because many college-age students just weren't aware of James Randi. So I don't think I adequately prepared them to appreciate just how prolific he has been in skepticism and magic, so that they could be in the same kind of awe of him that I am.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard because you have to first build out the legend for people to understand if they haven't seen it. Now, if you had said maybe Penn and Teller or whatever, because I know that they are, I don't know, acolytes of his, or, very, he was very influential to them, if I recall.
That's right. He introduced them to each other.
Okay. I knew that they saw him as a mentor of sorts, essentially.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, I definitely wanted to bring that up because that was right in line with it. And Randi seemed to be very much taking on the legacy of Houdini in my mind, of proving charlatans and the like. And Houdini's came from the his personal experience of his mother dying and having trouble dealing with it and going to every medium out there and then going, well, wait a minute, this is a rig, this is a rig, this is a rig. And I think he conflicted with Arthur Conan Doyle, but I don't remember. I'm not great on
Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a legitimate believer and hosted seances regularly and was constantly calling upon Houdini to come and sit in on these seances, which, Houdini would very promptly debunk. But Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was a deep believer in spiritualism.
Which is interesting, too. And I've got a super chat. Thank you, Mike Bruno. I used to love to watch The Amazing Kruskal.
Yeah, I don't know as much about Kruskal as I should. I think his heyday was just a little bit prior to me being conscious of all of this. When I first became really aware of Kruskal, I think it was already when he was past his prime and was doing. This is bad. I mean, my first memory of Kruskal was seeing him fail on Regis and Kathy Lee with a really simple magic trick that nobody should have failed with. I mean, I think that colored my perception of Kruskal. If I did a deeper dive into Kruskal's history, I probably would appreciate him more. I do know that he was incredibly adept at something called muscle reading. Or Hellstromism, which is this thing that I am in awe of, where kind of like the ideomotor response, perhaps you're familiar with this. It's the thing that drives the Ouija board and the thing that drives pendulums. Like when you think of some motor action, it's hard to suppress your tendency to engage in that motor action just a little bit.
Like dowsing or no?
It is very much like dowsing. Well, Kruskal famously would have the person who hired him hide his paycheck somewhere in the auditorium. And he would have them up on stage. So they're the only person that knew where his paycheck had been hidden. And I believe the way he did it was they would hold one end of a handkerchief and he would hold the other. And he would sort of lead them through the auditorium, feeling differences in their resistance as he moved, so that he could hone in on where his paycheck was hidden.
Okay, and so never play poker with that man.
Yeah, I think not. Yep.
Because if he could pick up the vibration, I have a feeling he would be a nightmare for.
Yeah, for many years, because there's not a big literature on that, I assumed it was sort of apocryphal. And then I had a fellow named Christopher Carter come to speak to my students at Carthage College when I taught my Science of Magic course a few years ago. And on a whim, I brought up the topic of muscle reading, and he said, "Oh, well, you want to see it?" And he had a student think of any object in the room And he figured out what it was just by feeling differences in their muscle tension as he guided them around the room. And it was a pencil. They thought about a pencil that was in the room. So that convinced me that there is more than meets the eye to muscle reading.
Well, this is good because this starts to bring us to the topic at hand. I honestly had never heard of you. You reached out to me because of a former guest I've had who I'm happy to have had on. She is a very good guest, very entertaining. And it's Michelle Dresbold, and she's a handwriting expert. Now, there's some argument between you and her as in terms of degree and things like that. And I want to point out you were on another show about it, which is fine. The host on the other show did annoy me a little bit. I'm going to push back on him in the fact that her name is Dresbold and not Nesbold.
I caught that too. Yep.
And I am not going to go and say, oh, because you disagree with what she was saying, I'm not going to just immediately throw her under the bus and say, oh, everything she's doing is wrong, because I don't think that would be quite fair all around, because she has helped the police. She has been trained by Secret Service. So there is a definite strong legitimacy to much of what she does. I think that you have some issue with specific claims.
Yeah.
Is that a fair assessment?
Absolutely. And I appreciate it. I watched one of your interviews with her. I don't know how many you've done. I watched one of them, and I really appreciated that you started out the interview by asking her whether she was a graphologist, and she sort of punted on it, first denying that she was a graphologist, just calling her herself a handwriting expert. But then she doubled back and essentially said that a subset of what she's doing is graphology. And it's this graphology component that I have gripes with, and that speaks to my areas of expertise as a cognitive psychologist. I have no reason to take issue with the work that she was trained on with the FBI, with this document comparison and identification work. I think there's legitimacy to that. But everything that she said about making inferences about a person's personality from features of their handwriting is graphology and is pseudoscience, for which there is no evidence, and it's not for lack of trying. Right? There have been scads of studies on graphology, on the extent to which characteristics of our personality are represented in variability of our pen strokes. And those studies historically have found no evidence to support the claims.
Now, I'm going to push a little on that. And the reason is that you throw around the term pseudoscience. Let's be honest, psychology is called a pseudoscience. And I hate to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this, because we do have, pseudoscience that can be scams. But we have pseudoscience, as we were just talking about earlier, where we haven't had the capability to actually prove out things that anecdotally have been seen to be true. And that's why I brought up Jonathan Haidt. It was very specific on that. And I think you'll agree with other things that we are finding out all kinds of amazing stuff with fMRIs, because now we can actually go and say, okay, well, the brain's lighting up in different areas. So in the areas of influence and persuasion, as an example, they're starting to actually see the dopamine hits and different things that are resonating in the brain. Would you agree?
Sure, but I also think that fMRI has serious limitations in what it can actually tell us about behavior. If there's any kind of difference in behavior, it's gonna be echoed in brain activity.
Sure.
But knowing where in the brain something is happening, or where there seems to be heightened oxygen consumption, doesn't actually tell us how the brain is doing anything, or what the brain is doing, for that matter. So knowing where something happens tells us exactly nothing about how something happens or what specifically is happening. So I think fMRI is limited in its ability to speak to the kinds of things that we're talking about. Dresbold did state that handwriting activates more of the brain, as if that somehow means that it carries extra information than any other form of communication. I would probably dispute her claim that there is a lot of additional activation when you're handwriting compared to when you're typing. I think the whole brain is active all the time, and there may be subtle differences in what's active when you're engaging in handwriting compared to typing, but I don't think those differences point to any added utility in reading a person's personality from their handwriting. Handwriting isn't special
Right.
when it comes to comparing it to any other motor behavior.
I thought it was. I thought they actually have done studies recently, studies on studying, which is very redundant, I apologize, but that people who in a class handwriting notes have retained information better than those even typing, using the same argument, both motor skills, if I recall. And these studies have been pretty consistent recently that by actually physically handwriting it out, that they're retaining the information better. So that would imply that there may be a little bit more activity, but not necessarily.
No, it would not. The explanation for that phenomenon, which I do not dispute, is that we tend to be slower handwriters than we are typists. And so when you're taking handwritten notes, you can't transcribe verbatim what's happening in class the same way you can when you're typing. And so you have to engage in deeper processing. You have to synthesize what you're hearing so that you can come up with a way to communicate it for yourself in handwritten form in a way that'll be understandable later. And so the thought processes that lead to you taking in this information from the world, synthesizing it, and then turning it into shorthand of your own, that's the process that makes it more memorable. This is a process we call deep processing. There's a classic experiment carried out by Craik and Lockhart back in the 60s, I don't know, where they presented people with a bunch of words. I say on the screen, I can't remember if it was on the screen, it doesn't really matter. But they gave people different tasks to engage in with these words. Some people had to say whether each word was printed in all caps or not. So a very simple visual analysis. You didn't even need to know what the words were to judge whether they were all caps or not. Some people had to look at each word and judge whether it rhymes with some other word that they were given. So you didn't necessarily need to know what the words meant. You just needed to know what they sounded like to perform that task. And the third group had to categorize each word. Is this word a type of kitchen appliance, right? So in order to do that task, they had to not only know what the word was, but know what the word means. Well, after this task, there was a surprise memory test. They had people recall all the words they could remember seeing during that first phase. Well, the people that just judged whether the words were in all caps or not had no friggin' memory for the words. They couldn't remember anything. The people who had to do this acoustic analysis remembered marginally more, and the people who had to do this categorization task remembered a ton. And so what was different?
The memory palace. That's not that different than memory palace, is it?
No, it's not that different. That's why the memory palace works, because you're integrating new information with information you already understand, that already lives in long-term memory. And that's what people are doing when they're taking good notes in class. They're not just regurgitating what's being said, they're integrating this new information with things they already know about the world. So handwriting, by virtue of it slowing you down, forces you to engage in this more deliberative process of figuring out what's the appropriate shorthand that'll remind me of this information later. Whereas when you're typing, most students I've seen, they are just trying to do transcription, which is a very low-level process, doesn't require any kind of deep analysis in the moment, and doesn't lead to any resilient long-term memories.
All right, to be fair to the chat, I guess we need to go into this.
Oh.
Wait, what is the memory palace? And yes, it is bad to get, because I'll get in deep and start arguing whatever, but yeah, great thing. And I'll go to you. You're an expert on explaining the memory palace.
Yeah, memory palace, sometimes called the method of loci. The idea is that if you want to remember a list of meaningless content, like maybe the order of a deck of playing cards, you should visualize those items as you learn them, placing each item in a specific location in a space that you know like the back of your hand, like your home. So if I wanted to memorize the order of a deck of cards, as I'm looking at each card, I would mentally walk through my house and imagine each card at a different location in my house. And so if I then want to reconstruct the order of that deck, all I need to do is mentally walk through my house again and see which cards are at which locations.
And it's always the same locations in the same order, correct?
That's correct. Yep. Always have to have the same path through your home in order for it to work. And memory experts, memory competitors use this strategy to memorize a bunch of decks of cards on the fly.
Yeah,
and
I had Sister Santos on, who I think won one of those competitions.
Cool. Years ago, I was part of an Australian documentary called... I think it was called Redesign My Mind or Redesign My Brain, where a guy just wanted to see how much change he could make in his behavior through different forms of brain training just for 1 month. Ooh. And one of the things that he tried to do was to memorize the order of a deck of playing cards using the method of loci. And after 1 month practicing this every day, just for an hour or something, he was able to do it. And he entered into a competition. He didn't win, but he was able to remember the order of a deck of playing cards using the memory palace technique. So it's legit. Yeah. Well, he was also highly motivated for it to work. Otherwise, the TV show is going to be super boring, right? If he fails at all of these tasks at the end.
Yeah, good point. But no, that's still entertainment.
Yeah.
I mean,
sure.
That's the cool thing. I mean, ironically, that's why I do the show. I can challenge you, you can tell me I'm dumb, and then spank me down, but that's still entertaining. It doesn't really matter if I'm right or wrong, and if I'm wrong, I'll probably learn even more.
Sure.
So I know it's an odd behavior, and yeah, I had to share that one of our chatters uses the memory palace technique to remember their shopping.
Yeah.
So practical use, I guess.
Absolutely. Yep. I mean, I tell my students, so in the history of psychology of memory, they use these kinds of tasks a lot, like this sort of arbitrary list of words, studying your memory for this arbitrary list of words. And I tell students that my results tend not to look like the data in the journals anymore because I now have all this practice using things like memory palace and all these strategies that Joe Schmo off the street isn't going to use when they engage in one of these experiments. Yeah, so that's one potential confound that could show up if you get a bunch of people that are familiar with the literature to be participants in some of these basic memory experiments.
But that's one of the issues, right? Is that, you have science and respectable people, and then magicians and street performers and things like that were not necessarily considered the most respectable part of society. And thus it's the same way. It's like, okay, do you really want to understand things about how to communicate with others and negotiate? Then go to the top level salesman in the world. And nobody likes salesmen, but boy, they could communicate. So I would argue that there's a certain amount of snobbery that is perhaps holding back information that can be learned from people who are doing things. They don't have a name for it. They don't know the scientific process or why it works. All they know is they were taught that by their grandfather or whomever, and it just works. And
that is the biggest challenge of doing the kind of science that I do, this science of magic stuff. Magicians do not need to know why what they do works. They only need to know that it works. And so magicians don't talk about their magic in a way that makes it readily accessible to scientists, right? We need to have our topics put into terms that are clear and directly testable, right? To use parlance we teach in research methods, we need these things to have operational definitions, specific definitions that make them immediately testable. And so the biggest challenge that I have is reading these works of magic theory that are written for other magicians and figuring out exactly what the author means. Like, how can I distill this into something that is specific enough that I can take guesses about, like, its limits. Where does this work? Where doesn't this work? And how can I test it? So that's the first challenge. And I often talk about, a lot of my work is in the area of attention. And so obviously everything I read includes the word misdirection.
Right.
But misdirection is a term that is pretty hard to pin down. If I get a dozen magicians in the room and I ask them to give me a definition of misdirection, I'm going to get a dozen different definitions, because it turns out it's this umbrella term that's actually describing lots of different processes or lots of different tasks. And so you're right. There is lots of potentially valid information hanging out in the arts, and that's being transmitted from one generation of artists to the next. And that seems to work, but we don't necessarily know why it works, and we don't know what the limits are. Like, when does it work and when doesn't it work? And that's what science really needs to be there to do. For example, magicians talk about subtleties. So when you're doing some piece of sleight of hand, they're little extra, like, suggestions you can plop on top. They're just little touches that you can add to the sleight of hand that they say will make it more impactful. And
Like
magicians,
flourish,
maybe a flourish, okay, here, let me give you just a dumb example. So here's a classic piece, probably unnecessary. This is not going to be great magic. Do not get your hopes up. There's a classic piece of sleight of hand called the French drop. Looks like that. It's a false transfer of a coin from one hand to the other. The coin actually, it's hard to do this in slow motion. The coin drops to the fingertips after the hand closes around it. So it looks like you're taking the coin, but you're not. And there are many different subtleties that magicians can layer on top of that basic action. Like, for example, pointing to where the coin should be, or letting your gaze follow the location that the coin should be, or letting body tension imply weight where there is no weight. There are all of these separate little cues that magicians suggest will make that piece of sleight of hand better.
There's also the optical illusion, right? That because that coin has a shininess and you have a light on you, that it's going to burn the impression in our eye.
It'll leave an after image.
Look like it's still in your hand.
Yeah.
Even though it dropped down, the lingering image will appear.
Yeah. So there are all these tiny little touches that a magician will add to this thing, but no magician is ever in a position to test the effectiveness of one of those in the absence of all the others. So it's this recipe where we magicians could be very superstitious about the techniques that we use. We could believe that every additional subtlety will have an added benefit in deception, even though we've never actually tested the effectiveness of these independently. The only way we could know whether each subtlety actually has added benefit is to test them independently of each other. But we don't do it, and so we can have all these faulty beliefs about what actually makes the illusion strong.
That's interesting. So is that what you are doing? So, I mean, you could run or build an experiment technically and only do the weight technique.
Yep.
And then do another with another 20 people or whatever, or just volunteers, and then see which one. And that would be so hard to judge, though.
So hard.
Because how do you prove, okay, well, nobody sees it. They don't know. How do you know if it's more effective if they think you put it in the hand? They think you put it in the hand. They don't think more so. It's like being partially pregnant. It's either they think it or they don't.
Exactly. That's the challenge here. How do we come up with effective ways to measure what we think we're measuring? And how do we design these stinking experiments to actually tap into what we want to tap into? Like, I could never, I mean, I don't have the capability of doing the experiment we're talking about, because there's no way I, as a human, could control one of these subtleties independently of all the others. They're so like deeply integrated with each other in my behavior that I couldn't produce behavior that only manipulates one of them. I'd have to get like an artificial actor on a computer, right? I'd have to get a robot to do this,
because
where
you could slow it down enough.
Yep.
Is that the problem too? Is you'd have to practice going as slow as humanly possible to see which.
Yep. There's a lot of complexity here and a lot of potentially confounding variables that we aren't thinking to control or can't control. Yeah. Yep. So that problem has shaped the kind of research I do and has in many ways dictated the research questions that I will actually approach versus those that just rattle around in the back of my mind, like the French drop thing.
So things like black magic or black trick,
black art magic.
Black art is much more duplicatable, right? In terms of you can have this environment, whether people see it or they don't see it.
Yeah.
Yes or no. So is that easier in terms of experimentals?
It would be. So I think as a general rule, the earlier something happens in the process between sensation and perception, the easier it is to study. This is, going down a bit of a rabbit hole, but let me describe to you the process of visual perception. So
that's why we're here.
so the earliest vision scientists called themselves the structuralists. They were studying the structures of thought, and their fundamental theory was that the very first steps in perception are the extraction of basic features from the world around us. So things like contours and shading and angles and depth and maybe not even depth, color, all that stuff. So the very first stages of processing of visual information are the extraction of these basic features at different regions in space. And then as activation through the brain progresses, we are piecing together those features into more and more complicated combinations until we get to like a complete perception of a face, which can be broken down into all of these basic features. Eyes can be broken down into these like little convex edges and contours and shading. Sure. And so if we're studying something like contrast, which is what black art is, let me give a quick description of black art magic. If I have a stage that's draped in flat black fabric, if I have something in front of that flat black fabric that's also draped in flat black fabric, you won't be able to see it against the background. There are no shadows, so there's no sense of depth. So I could whisk the black sheet off of that thing and it would just appear on stage and it would look super magical. Well, the reason it works is because those earliest stages of visual perception are the extraction of edges. And if there are no edges to be seen, there is no object to be perceived. So that one would be super easy to study because it's exploiting this very early stage in the process between sensation and perception. But all of this stuff with the French drop, Omar Pasha, great. All this stuff with the French drop, that is activating assumptions that humans make about the world after they've extracted all of these features and stuff from the environment. Like that's very late in the late stage process between sensation and perception. So yeah, as a rule of thumb, the further you get down that road, the harder it is to study because there's such a multitude of factors that impact it.
Wow, that's okay. And
sorry if that was opaque.
Not at all. It makes total sense because you're going into the series of movements and all that. And that's why I guess trompe-l'oeil and things like that are so effective. Is they're early on how we perceive an image that's put in front of us, and we're chunking it or shortcutting.
Yeah,
because we have to essentially say, okay, predator, yes, no.
Yeah, that's right.
Is that food? or we food.
Yep. And if there's any sort of bias present that leads us to jump to conclusions about such things, like the presence of a predator, that bias will be heightened when we are stressed. Mm-hmm. So if we're in a stressful situation, we are going to be more apt to see patterns where there are no patterns. If we see a rustle in the bushes and we're stressed out, we're going to assume there's a friggin' tiger in those bushes if we're our ancestors. And so that's something that magicians exploit readily as well.
Well, there's a DNA argument for that too. Because,
of course,
truthfully, if Og and Org were walking around, and if Og heard the rustle and ran off, and Org went to look, Org didn't survive to pass down his genes.
Exactly.
The one who was scared passed the genes down.
That's right, and that's why we are so biased towards over-detection of patterns. Yep, it is an evolutionarily endowed tendency. But that tendency can be pushed around by situational variables. So the example I always go to, what were your guys' names, Og and Grog?
Sure.
Okay. If Og eats some berries and he gets sick, Og's tendency to test the hypothesis that it's the berries that made him sick will be dependent on the environment in which he's living. If it's a time of drought and he doesn't have a lot of food sources, Og's probably going to test the hypothesis. He's going to go back to those berries and try again. But if it's a time of where there are foods all around, Og's not going to test that hypothesis. He's just going to go find a different food source, and he's going to step away with the potentially faulty assumption that those berries were what made him sick. So our tendency toward testing these illusory correlations will vary with all sorts of different environmental pressures. So as with anything, it's both nature and nurture that drive us toward these potentially erroneous assumptions about the world.
Well, here's a different thought. Make everything in your fridge black, background and items. This is how you lose weight.
I dig it. I need any strategy I can take.
Oh, no. Let me put that up. Crazy strategy. Now, do you go into that a lot or in your teaching? Because I do like the fact that all of our patterns are there for a reason. They're not necessarily a defect. Like, I feel like people who exploit our hardwiring kind of treat it like, oh, well, yeah, you're a bunch of, rubes and idiots and whatever, it's like it's a defect. It's like, no, this was actually an adaptation and why we exist now as a species. They're very valuable.
Yes. So when Dan Simons and Chris Chabris got famous with their invisible gorilla demonstration that you've already talked about, a lot of people who hadn't thought too much about it framed it as a failure of attention, right? Look at how we failed to see this gorilla, this obvious thing right in front of us. Why did we fail to see it? Well, in many ways, it's not a failure. It is a success. It is a success in our ability to control our attention and focus on the things that are relevant in the moment. So people may remember that you weren't just watching basketball players in that original gorilla video. You were given a task. You were tasked with counting how many times players wearing white shirts passed a basketball around while ignoring a bunch of players wearing black shirts. And so the fact that a huge majority of people, 50% of people, failed to see that gorilla doesn't mean that they sucked. It means that they were successfully engaged with the task. They were successfully tuning their attention to the players wearing white shirts so that they could succeed at that task and filtering out all the things that were irrelevant to that very task.
Now, didn't they also ask those who saw the gorilla that they couldn't come up with a number of passes and things like that? So,
if you saw the gorilla, you probably didn't count the number of passes correctly. You failed at that task for sure.
Well, and that kind of leads into a theory I have. I have a lot of body language experts on and people who are in that field, and a high number of them are either ADD or dyslexic or both. And using that same experiment, because I personally think that everybody has a condition. It's not necessarily, I think that there's an evolutionary reason that they have it. That there's a reason that there are people who are ADD and they're not, and things like that. That, as a species, we have a need for it. So could it be argued that some of the people are not going to see the gorilla because they're really good at counting and focusing, and other people are going to see the gorilla and help prevent others from getting eaten? If, let's say, it was a lion or a tiger. So, as a society, maybe both roles have a significant role, or both roles have a significant role, have a significant reason for existing in order to kind of adapt going forward.
Sure. It's quite possible. And again, not a clinician, so I can't necessarily speak directly to that. But all of these behaviors fall upon a continuum, and they always have fallen upon a continuum. We, with our DSM, have kind of set this point where we say something is diagnosable, probably because it seems to have a negative impact on a person's well-being. But it's quite possible that these tendencies toward ADHD either were beneficial evolutionarily or came along with some behavior that was itself beneficial. Some of these things might just be side effects of another behavior that we did that was evolutionarily endowed. What evolutionary biologists would call exaptations. And
Well, I
one
bring
of
it up
the
because, like, I know somebody who are dyslexic, and like David Boyes. I don't know if you've heard of him. He's the one who brought down Microsoft
okay.
and Bill Gates and all that. Very world famous lawyer. Very severe dyslexic. Apparently can barely read briefs. I mean, according to his own words, but he will remember everything that's ever said to him in whichever order, because his whole life has been spent adapting to the environment and having to observe things that are going around. And also in Sleights of Mind, they talked about how people with autism are very difficult to trick when using what is that, shared mind, or there's a term for it.
Yeah, it's theory of mind.
Theory of mind.
probably.
Theory of mind.
Yeah.
Anything theory of mind really is
Sure.
is challenging when you're dealing with someone with autism.
Yeah. I mean, autism is still not well understood. And so to return to your dyslexia example, if you are not devoting attentional resources to like dealing with this complexity of reading in the moment, well, that means you've got attentional resources left over that you can devote to other things that you might be better at dealing with in the moment. So I think it probably all comes down to just a difference in attention. If other folks had this, this is hard to simplify. Okay, let me go to autism. So we often talk about autistic savants, right? We see these people who seem to have these deep deficits in social interaction and maybe other behaviors, but they have these little islands of remarkable ability. Like they're memory savants, people who can just remember a bunch of stuff they see. They're all these musical savants.
A lot of computer scientists that are, quote, spectrumy.
Yeah. Well, originally there was this assumption that they must just have different brains, right? They must be using their brains differently than other people or have differently adapted brains. And there's some more modern research that suggests, yes, there are differences in the way their brains behave because of autism, but there isn't any sort of magical adaptation that lets them have this savantism. It's just a difference in motivation and attention. People who are not apt to engage in some of these social behaviors and focus all their energy and motivations in these social areas, well, they have attention left over to do other stuff with it. And many of them find these passions in music or memorizing works of literature, right? It's an attentional difference.
No,
it's
great
not
point.
due to some big difference in the structures of their brains.
That's
And so
a great
the same
point.
Same thing could be happening with the dyslexia example.
It's funny you said that. It makes me think of a story that Adam Carolla, another pretty big podcaster, always talks about. But John Popper of Blues Traveler
Okay.
is just a phenomenal musician. He plays a harmonica like like nobody. Adam Carolla's theory, and always cracks me up, is that, well, that's because he wasn't getting laid in high school. Because you know that the one who's not getting laid in high school is the one who's practicing every night on the musical instrument. And because they have all that time to focus. So it cracks me up, but there's probably some truth to that.
Yeah.
That a lot of the musicians, they don't have a great social life necessarily in high school, but they practice like magicians.
That's right. You want to see something?
Absolutely.
Okay, so here, watch this. How do you do that? You give up your childhood. That's how you do that. You sit at home in your bedroom alone with a deck of cards for hours on end, and then you can do that. Yeah, so Carolla's probably right.
Well, speaking of which, do you have any examples to show, about to demonstrate attentional disorder or anything else?
Oh, okay. You want to see something?
Of course.
Okay, since we're talking about attention, this probably will fail, but it'll give you a sense of some of the ways that I work on things. I'm going to show you a video. I'm going to play a video. There's no sound to it, so we don't have to worry about that. And after we watch the video, I'm going to ask you some questions about what you've seen, and everybody who's watching should play along. So
God,
here,
I have a terrible short-term memory. I have to take notes.
All right. So here we go. All right, so the question for you and your viewers is, where was the coin when last you saw it? Was it here? Or was it here? What do you think? Eric, was it on the left or was it on the right when last you saw it?
Okay, I'm going to give the chat a chance to respond.
Okay, all right. So and just to be clear, it's the viewers left and right. So this is the left one. This is the right one. I always have a hard time describing that.
Okay. Well, good. Got a couple of people in. We got the right. We got the left. It's on the left.
Yes. So the correct answer is there. It's on the left. So if you got it wrong, you're not alone. In the laboratory, about half of people get that question wrong. So let's watch it again so that you can redeem yourself if you got it wrong. And if you got it wrong, you should focus your attention on the center of the placemat. Ignore all the action. That's just misdirection.
There it is.
Yep. So this.
But you had it in a slow enough motion. I mean, it's.
So this was a stimulus that I developed to study inattentional blindness in the laboratory using magic. So I always say it's rare to be at a basketball game and miss a gorilla walking across the court, but it's not so rare to be at a magic show and miss all sorts of things that are happening right in front of your eyes. So magic provides this sort of real world tool for studying inattentional blindness. Of course, we've got all sorts of confounds going on here. We've been talking about magic, so you knew there was some sort of deception coming up. We talked about inattentional blindness and attention, so you knew there was something fishy going on. But if we removed all that stuff and we had you come into a laboratory that you didn't know studied magic and watch that video on a computer, about half of you would be oblivious to this shiny moving object just in peripheral vision. Yeah, so I've done a variety of experiments exploring using this trick to study the dynamics of inattentional blindness. And in fact, not long ago, I published a paper with Machnick and Martinez-Conde from Sleights of Mind, where we used that magic trick to study microsaccades, teeny tiny little movements that your eyes make when you're fixated on something. So if you're holding your eyes still, looking at something, your eyes aren't usually still. They're still twitching, just a little bit. And people used to think that it was just twitching to kind of move the image a little bit on your retina so that you wouldn't fatigue photoreceptors.
I was going to say, is that like the screensaver burn-in?
Yes, it's exactly like that. That was the earliest idea. But it turns out they do that and they do much more. There's a direction to these microsaccades. Most of them are horizontal, some of them are vertical. They go in all different directions. And we presented evidence that the microsaccades point to the place that your attention is focused independently of your eyes. So when people watch that trick, most of them are looking up at the cup while that coin is moving. But some of the people who are looking at the cup still see the coin down in their peripheral vision. Some don't. Well, we found that the people who see the coin are making more vertical microsaccades than the people who don't see the coin.
So some are wired to see it.
That I don't know if I'd say wired. It's just an outward. It's an outward cue to where your attention may be placed, independently of where your eyes are looking. So we can move our attention independently of our eyes, right? Like I can be looking at the screen, but attending over here to my coffee maker, right? It's blurry. It's in my peripheral vision, but I can attend to it. And probably my eyes are making horizontal microsaccades as I look here, but focus over here.
Oh, that makes sense. Let me see. Super chat here. I lived in Chicago and learned to pay attention to everything going on around me. I saw a woman get pickpocketed on the train and learned.
Yeah. Yep. So the techniques of pickpockets are meant to work on the person they're pickpocketing, not on the people that are watching from afar, right?
Well, the first trick with that would be to keep everybody far from you.
That's right.
I would say, in terms of pickpocketing, it's like, if nobody's within 10 feet of me, they're not going to pick my pocket. I feel.
Yeah. Pickpockets use the same techniques of misdirection that magicians do. They're just higher stakes.
Yeah, that's true. Very true.
And if you read Sleights of Mind, you read all about Apollo Robbins, who uses these techniques of misdirection to great effect in theatrical pickpocketing.
Which is, remarkable.
Yeah.
I'm sure he was always innocently theatrical.
Yes.
All right. Do you have any other examples?
Well, should we just try something fun? Something that everybody can learn and use to mess with their significant others? Okay, so this is something you can do with a pack of cards. I'll tell you how you do it with a pack of cards, but I'm going to do it a different way. So what you would need to do is get one suit from a deck of playing cards, ace through king, and put them in order with the ace on the face, the king on the back. I'll describe how to do this with the cards, but I'm going to do it in a more interactive way right now so that folks can play along.
Look at that.
Eric, yeah, so there is all of those cards I just spoke about. Eric, what I'd like you to do is think of one of those cards. Just think of it, just the value, not the suit, since they're all spades. So think of ace, or four, or queen. Just think of one. Do you have one?
Sure.
Okay. So what I'd like you to do, Eric, and everybody else at home can play along as well. If you probably hate touching your computer monitor, so but I'm going to ask you to do so. I'd like you to put your finger on the ace right now.
Okay.
And we're going to engage in some spelling. So probably your initial thought of card wasn't completely random, right? We can't behave randomly. We stink at random behavior. So I'm going to inject a little bit of randomness into this card selection. So you're thinking of a card. I want you to put your finger on the ace, and I want you to spell the name of that card, moving one card clockwise for every letter in the word. So if I was thinking of queen, I'd go Q, U, E, E, N, and I'd end on the 6. This is super hard to do on my end. Okay,
so wait, the first letter is the first one over, or the current one is the first letter?
So your first move will be for the first letter. So you'll be on the 2 after your first letter. Yep.
Okay.
Right. Okay, so your finger is now on a card, probably not the card you thought of originally. You can see we're injecting some randomness. So whatever card you landed on after that first round of spelling, I'd like you to keep spelling. Keep moving forward clockwise around the circle, spelling whatever card you landed on that first time.
Okay.
Make sense?
I'm gonna spell the same card over and over.
No. Whatever card you landed on.
Okay, I landed on
then
a card.
spell
Do it
that
again.
one.
Okay.
Yep, but just continuing forward on the clock of cards. Okay, so are you on a new card now?
Yeah, I'm 2
All right,
down now.
whatever card you've landed on now, spell that one. Just keep going around the circle.
Okay.
All right, you're on another card now?
Yeah, I'm a couple down. Yeah.
All right, let's, I'm going to ask you a series of questions about your card, but I want you to lie to me.
Okay.
Actually, just say yes to every question I ask you. I'll just ask you yes or no questions, and you just say yes, okay?
All right.
Can you put your video feedback on for a moment?
Yeah, sure.
I want to see you. Oh,
There
there
you
you are. Does your card have a number on it?
Yeah.
Say yes. Say yes.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Does your card have a letter on it?
Yes.
Does it have a number on it?
Yes.
Is it a high card?
Yes.
I'm going to just say some cards, and I want you to say yes every time.
Okay.
Was it the Jack?
Yes.
Was it the Queen?
Yes.
Was it the King?
Yes.
Was it the Queen?
Yes.
Was it the King?
Yes.
I think it was the King. I think you ended on the King. After all of these rounds of spelling, your finger ended up on the King. Is that correct?
Sure. Yes.
Oh, it seems like it didn't. Was anybody else playing along from afar? Because it always ends on the King.
Okay.
So this is a mathematical property of a
No, it
pack
did end
of...
on the King. I just was like, did I go one beyond that or not? I didn't.
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. So this is known as the Kruskal Principle. And it was actually most understood by a mathematician named Kruskal and then taken over by magicians for nefarious means. And this is the basis for lots of modern statistical techniques. No matter what card you think of at the start, after 3 rounds of spelling, it converges on the same solution. So how can you do this at home with your friends if you don't have these virtual cards? Well, you can do it by spelling by removing one card from the face and putting it to the back of the pack for every letter. And after they've spelled 3 times, the card that's facing them will be the King. So you can use that to mess with your friends. And you can use these cover stories like I used, like a lie detection cover story if you want. Or you could have them write out a series of cards, and you could use graphological inference to guess their card.
That's interesting. That's because
it came back full circle. There you go.
Number of letters within each one. The Queen, the 8, the 7 have longer. The Ace is shorter.
Yep.
So somehow in it balances out.
Just works out that way. Yep.
That is probably a strange coincidence.
Yeah, I think it is just totally coincidental. But if you start with a shuffled deck of playing cards and you kind of use this procedure as you deal out cards, by the end of the deck, the last card someone will have when they can't go any further, everybody would end on that card no matter where they started. And it's hard to describe. But this tendency for a path to converge on one solution is the basis for lots of modern statistical techniques where we repeat a process again and again in hopes of arriving at an estimate of what is the true state of the world, if you will.
Well, okay, there's a lot of that out there. I mean, the golden ratio, the Pareto principle, some very odd mathematical things. So yeah. The super laws or whatever you call it, definitely wild stuff. So Okay, to finish things out, I've been nudged in the chat, if you will, so I
Hmm.
cannot ignore them.
Okay.
People want to know, okay, so this all started with graphology.
Yeah.
And the question that is being asked is there anything at all to graphology of value or not?
So what the science has to say is that the only things you can infer about a person based on their handwriting are gender, socioeconomic status, and degree of literacy. And these are on average. Like, this is not about any individual. These are on average. If you try this a bunch, for a group, you'll get age, gender, socioeconomic status, degree of literacy. And the last two are probably just a function of fluency, right? The people from higher socioeconomic status and higher degree of literacy just have more practice handwriting. So their handwriting is going to be more fluent just because of the practice. And those two, socioeconomic status and degree of literacy, might be correlated with some personality variables, but probably only weakly. So there's almost nothing from a person's personality that can be reliably inferred from features of their handwriting. So graphology is pretty much complete nonsense. Even though in Germany and in France, big corporations still hire graphologists to evaluate job applicants. Job applicants will send in their resumes in handwritten form so that a graphologist can look at them and judge whether they're a good fit for
In
the
fairness,
job.
they use the polygraph for the CIA.
Yeah, sure.
That's
Except
garbage too.
it is garbage, but probably that's mostly used as a way to persuade them into telling the truth rather than making deep inferences from the results of that polygraph, right? Because the results of that polygraph not admissible in court anyway. So it's probably a means of persuasion much of the time.
But if you have to take a polygraph in order to get a government job and
that's what you're talking about. Yeah. Well, but it'll also persuade people to be honest about their backgrounds if they think that they might be caught. Yeah, I think it's probably a means of pressure more than anything else.
Yeah, I've had somebody who's crusaded and spent time in prison about it.
Wow.
He likened it to a rubber hose.
Yeah, that's fair.
Okay, quick random questions here. Do females have neater handwriting than males on average? Anecdotally, from what I've seen, but I wouldn't say that's true.
Yeah, I don't know that there are really any real data on that. But again, allow me to be stereotypical for a moment. Probably females tend to have more practice handwriting too. They probably tend to be socialized to engage in behaviors that lead to handwriting more than males do.
No, yeah, that makes sense. Culturally speaking, like
Yeah.
a lot of times RSVPs and things like that
Sure.
are written. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So
I
that would
mean,
just be-
I feel like I'm just going to get in trouble. But when I was when I was a kid in school, I didn't write a lot of notes and pass notes. It was maybe my female colleagues. I don't know. but I think we are socialized. Yeah, there you go. So if we look at habits of speech, right? Males and females are just socialized to engage with communication differently, right? Like just the way that we raise our children leads to substantial differences in the way that they communicate with each other. So it's not any necessarily real difference in biology beyond the fact that biology changes as you learn.
So somebody pointed this out, which is kind of a good pushback. Explain doctor's handwriting.
They are rushed, right? They probably make more money the more clients they get through in a day, and they have a lot of clients to get through. Actually, so I suspect it's a speed thing.
I wonder if there's more to it though, because even Sleights of Mind brought up the study they did where they had Chinese female students write about their gender before taking a math test, and they did poorer. But then when they started to write about their ethnicity, they did better because of cultural stereotypes. Is it possible that Dr. Handwriting has become such a cultural stereotype that you've got to earn that place?
It could be. It could be. I mean, I think stereotype threat has gotten a little more shaky in recent years. I think it's a less reliable phenomenon, but it's quite possible that that's a rite of passage for a doctor to have bad handwriting on their prescriptions until it leads to pharmacists making errors that that cause trouble.
God, they have computers, for God's sake.
Yeah.
Just send it in.
I wonder how many prescriptions are actually handwritten these days. I'm showing off the fact that I'm scared to go to a doctor so I don't get prescriptions.
Well, there's that. All right. So, Tony, this has been fantastic. Where can people learn a little bit more about you?
Sure. My website is anthonybarnhart.com. I say obnoxious things on Twitter at Magic Tony. That's probably the spot. So if you're really excited about this science of magic stuff, this is gaining steam. We now have researchers all around the world who are doing good science, taking inspiration from magic. So many that we've established the Science of Magic Association. And we have conferences every 2 years. The last one was hosted in 2019. I hosted it down in Chicago. We were supposed to have our next one this year. That ain't happening. But in lieu of a face-to-face conference, we are having a series of free, open to the public, virtual panel discussions with experts on a variety of topics under the Science of Magic umbrella. And we'll be rolling these out on the Science of Magic Association website in the next month because our first event is at the end of April, and it is the panel will be Magic for Non-Humans. We will have a researcher who works with blackbirds who has shown that they engage in deceptive techniques with their peers that are akin to the deceptive techniques that magicians have landed upon.
And we have crows, if I recall.
Yes, crows. Yep, corvid cognition is the
blue
key
jays.
term. Yep.
It's funny because we have blue jays in the yard, and I kept telling my wife, I'm like, they've got to be related to crows because they're smart asses.
Super smart, yeah.
Well, they're smart asses too. They have this tone where they mock you, and they just kind of, and I'm like, oh, they got to be related, and they are. So yeah.
Yep.
That's fascinating.
We'll also have a computer scientist who's developed artificial intelligence that can create magic tricks. Many of them kind of mathematical, like the one that I demonstrated today, since that's in a computer's wheelhouse. But each month, we're going to have a new panel discussion on a different topic. We have some very high-profile magicians and scientists who will be contributing to these panels. So keep an eye out for that. The website is scienceofmagicassociation.org. That'll get you there.
But it's not spelled out. It's ASOP,
If you spell it out, it'll get you there too.
Oh, cool. And by the way, I did put links in the description, everybody. So please check it out. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it. Tony, thank you so much.
Thanks. This was a lot of fun. I'm always excited to talk about this stuff.